Over the last 15 years, our next speaker, Nike Fajors, has launched 85 retail and e-commerce products and services, generating over $2.1 billion. A nationally respected business thought leader, he has been quoted in the New York Times, the Financial Times, and Business Week. He has traveled throughout East and West Africa, Europe, and Asia. His wife was born and raised in Kush, so-called now Sudan, and his talk is going to be about Africa and is titled 54 to 27.
Probably the thing I dislike the most is hearing stuff like that about what I did. I mean, all that really matters is that those 4 people up there and my 3 kids. That's my life and my world. But so the title of my talk is 54 to 27. 54 to 27. Was that the score of Super Bowl 40? No. 54 to 27 is a dream I have for Africa. There are 54 countries in Africa. You could call them countries. Some of them are the size of small cities, states in America. They're undersized. They were created oftentimes under great duress and turmoil. And fundamentally, they can't serve their citizens effectively. You know, small is not an advantage in governance and providing services to your people. If you look at countries today who have vision for what they want to accomplish, they are doing land deals. They're doing deals for water. They are trying to grow. And so in an Africa with 54 countries, there's really no opportunity to do that. Right now, there's a rather large debate because Ethiopia is trying to take control of their destiny by building a dam on the Nile, which begins in their country. And there's a huge debate about whether they have the rights to control a river that passes through their country. You know, if you think about Asia versus Africa, coming out of the colonial period, Asia has done much better. I don't think any of us would argue that point. Well, in fact, when you look at Asia, the average Asian country is 17% larger in terms of land mass than Africa, and over 300% larger in terms of population. Now, some might say, well, that's due to India and China. Well, be assured, the 19th century invaders in China would have loved to carve up China into 5, 6 countries, because you reduce the strength of a country when they become significantly smaller. Let me give a U.S. example, the state of Arizona. We're all familiar with it. Do you know how many countries, African countries, you can fit in Arizona? In the borders of Arizona, you can place Eritrea, Botswana, Namibia, Guinea-Bissau, Gabon, and Equatorial Guinea. I mean, are these countries or towns? In West Africa, you can drive for less than 12 hours and cross 4 countries. There's no strength in these tiny little towns that each have their own little king that is excited to be king of a street, a dirt road. You think about natural resources. Small countries cannot properly take advantage of the natural resources they have. If you look at the majority of countries in Africa, where I think we all know you name the mineral, you name the precious resource that exists in Africa, and none of them can properly refine those materials to produce a finished product. The revenue, the strength, the value is in the finished product. You know, you ever scratch your head and say, why is there a company called British Petroleum? Is there oil in this place called British? Obviously not. But they've gone around the world strategically and refined the products of other people. So when you're a tiny little country, you gotta ask for help because you're not capable of doing it yourself. You know, it frankly reminds me of Africa's greatest failure. Its greatest failure was when it decided to sell its own citizens to other people. Because if you ignore the human tragedy of it all, look at the business side of it. They sold those people for very little money. And let me tell you, I don't need to tell anyone in this room, the buyers of those enslaved human beings made a very nice profit. Imagine if Africa decided, instead of selling its own people to foreigners, if they came up with an economic model that actually allowed those people to work and build a more vibrant Africa. You know, after 2 centuries of selling its own people, Africa was basically a lifeless shell of itself, and Europe basically carved it up. They had a conference called the Berlin Conference, and they all decided which piece. This is where you get these little countries. I'll take this little piece. I'll take this little piece. And this is where you get the names of these countries. Ivory Coast, Gold Coast. Used to be a place called Monkey Bay. Half of the countries in Africa, the names are just simply the word black in a foreign language. Have you ever thought about it? Nigeria, Niger, even Ethiopia is sunburnt face. It's really, for me, it's very insulting that people still walk around with the names that their invaders gave them. Cameroon is a country in West Africa. It was invaded first by the Portuguese. Someone decided, they were walking around and they saw shrimp in a river. They said, oh, this is shrimp land. And so Cameroon is just simply a version of Portuguese for shrimp land. And yet people still walk around talking about, I'm from Cameroon. I don't understand it. Well, I do understand it, unfortunately. Cameroon, over the last 20 years, is consistently listed as the most corrupt country in the world. Any surprise? Half the country speaks French, and they have first names like Pierre. Do I look like a Pierre? I'm not. Do my kids look like Pierres? They're not. The other half of the country speaks English, and they have names like Paul. They've had a president, we'll call him that, for 35 years. He is supposedly a billionaire. This is the first lady and president of Cameroon. This is Paul and Chantal. They love the finer things in life. They love the French Riviera. They love custom-made French clothes. They like French food. I don't know how much they like their own people, but that's another point. So, how do we get past this? Well, the good news is there are some people with vision and courage that want to improve this situation. One is a company called Dagot Group in Nigeria. And they are building, as we speak, the very first oil refinery in the history of Africa. It'll be finished in 2021. And they'll actually be able to refine their own resource. Now, the implications of this are not just simply a prideful thing. They're going to save $10 billion a year just in foreign exchange costs. And for the first time in the history of their country, be able to provide all of their citizens with their oil and gas needs. And Nigeria is an oil-producing country, but yet today they have to import oil and gas into their country because they're not refining it. And so that brings me hope. That brings me some sense that things are, in fact, improving. You know, now is the time. Why would a continent continue to sit under laws and edicts and mandates that were established 150 years ago? I personally don't blame Europe. 150 years later, if you haven't woken up, the issue is you, not someone that came into your country some many years ago. So how do we get from 54 to 27? I have a simple thought. The first is any country that has less than 5 million people has to be considered for integration. Any so-called country that has less than 150,000 square kilometers of land considered for integration. Any country whose native languages are not part of the official languages has to be considered for integration. I mean, I think we all know the importance of tongue. You know, I think language and DNA go together because there's such a relationship between how you speak. So there's many countries in Africa, their official languages, none of them are African languages. And then finally, any country that was created entirely via hostile takeover has to be considered for integration. Eritrea is a country, a neighbor of Ethiopia. And as I've studied it, it didn't exist until the Italians decided to try and take over Ethiopia, which they were not successful doing, but they were able to carve out this piece of land. They named it Eritrea. And one day, many years ago, probably 15 years ago, I was in D.C. and I had an Eritrean cab driver. And I asked him, why do you call yourself Eritrean? Aren't you just Ethiopian? And he said to me, oh, this is often what you'll hear from Africans, to be blunt. Names don't really matter. So I said to him, so if the Italians had called your country Donkey Land, you would have been okay calling yourself a donkey? And he sort of laughed and joked about it. But the reality is Ethiopia and Eritrea had a war for 19 years. And millions of people, brothers and sisters, killed each other over something that was created by someone that didn't even care about them. And joyfully, actually, just within the last year and a half, Ethiopia has gotten a great leader. Abe, who has made peace with Eritrea, has opened the borders, and literally brothers and sisters are seeing each other for the first time. In fact, he got the Nobel Prize, as you're probably aware, and part of that was making peace with his sister country. So there are positive examples that are progressing forward. Again, to just use one more U.S. example, no African country should be smaller than Missouri or have less people than Los Angeles. That gets you to 27. So, a message for the UN, the World Bank, the IMF, USAID, the State Department, they spend billions upon billions of your tax dollars giving loans and grants and training. I say to them, get on the right side of this issue, because your loans and grants haven't done much. But how about helping these countries to reintegrate their security systems, their rule of law, their government, so that they can actually operate as single countries? How about creating, cultural documentation so that people can sort of reintegrate? Because the reality is, I'm not talking about, China merging with Norway. These people share the same cultural values. Their DNA is identical. They eat the same food. They listen to the same music. But yet one labels themselves X, the other one labels themselves Y. Menelik II, Garvey, Nkrumah, Lumumba, El-Shabazz, Abe. Who will be our next Menelik? I say to African leaders, compassion, dignity, transparency, sacrifice. They don't require World Bank loans. We need leaders that are willing to put their people ahead of their own selfishness. I don't know that we're asking too much, but I can tell you, as an African American watching from afar, I'm fed up. I'm fed up with the Paul and Chantels living this wonderful life while their people suffer. I can tell you, my family, we're fed up with Africans being on the bottom of every statistic. Just fed up, and there's no need for it. But the solution is in our hands, not in the hands of the World Bank, the IMF, and all these wonderful institutions that flatter themselves and pat themselves on the back for the work that they do. It's in our hands. So 54 to 27. I hope my goal in this talk was that at least 20% of you would take what I had to say and maybe tell someone else. That's all I can really hope for. But let's see if we can do something to create a movement. I'm a business guy, right? So of course I secured the domain name 54to27.com, because who knows? But I appreciate your time. Thank you.